All right, so we're kind of putting our study of Esther on hold for this week so that I can jump at the chance to do something kind of weird and maybe offend someone. So we're going to be using Leviticus 23 as our starting point for what we're going to do this morning, but we're going to end up all over the place in the Bible, but always referring back to Leviticus. And so for some of you guys, this is going to be a review session. And for some of you, if you were not around here for the first part of last year, then this is maybe going to seem kind of crazy. All right, so I don't really have a satisfactory explanation for why this kind of thing is so weird for us. I mean, I can explain how we got here, but it still feels like there's this bizarre cultural resistance that's inherent to being a modern Christian that makes this topic something that we have a hard time getting our heads around. And so these cultural biases that we have and the doctrinal biases that we end up with sort of compound over time, generationally almost. And then there are, historical circumstances that kind of change the emphasis and change the intent of the ritual observances of religion until we wouldn't even really recognize things that maybe our great-grandfathers did in the name of the same religion that we're a part of. All right, so there's that, and then there's also the sinful nature of man that sort of insists that his own particular interpretation is right, and he will therefore defend his position at any cost. And all these things kind of come together to create this weird blind spot that we can maybe trace how we got here, but it still seems unexplainable, kind of weird why it's so blind. Okay, so I probably shouldn't have hit that button that early. All right, so we're talking about the festivals of the Lord, the Old Testament Jewish feasts, all right? And the last time we did this, it was 8 very intense weeks of studying the Bible. Okay, I'm going to cover half that material in just today. All right, and that means we have a lot to do this morning, and I never do a trial run of a teaching, so I don't have any idea how long we're going to be sitting here. I'm planning to hit the background and also the first 3 festivals so that we have some context for when those festivals hit the calendar this week. All right, so this is going to be a less detailed study a little bit than we did the first time, but I still want to hit most of the main points so that anybody that wasn't here last year can really get a sense for how cool this whole thing is. But if you feel like I missed something or I didn't prove some connection thoroughly, I would say that it's fair to just assume that I just axed those details in the name of time, okay, so that I could get through this all. So you can listen to last year's teaching online if you want some more details on this stuff. But Christians talking about Jewish festivals is a little strange, all right? And so many of us have been Christians for a very long time, but I would suggest that many of us don't know very much about the Jewish festival calendar until maybe we started talking about it last year. And so why is that? Well, it's because we're not Jewish, right? That's true. We're not Jewish, and there are things about being Jewish that we can never and will never be because most of us are Gentiles. But Christianity is actually a pretty Jewish thing, all right? So all of Christianity's founders and its Messiah were Jewish, and the Christian scriptures are all Jewish scriptures, or were written by Jewish men. And really, the very purpose of the national election of Israel was so that there would be this distinct group of people to bring the story to the world about how God works in history. So there are things that God required of the Jewish people in order to inform our understanding and teach us how God works in history and what God's plan for history looks like. All right, so one of the things that God laid out for the Jewish people to observe that I'm, pretty sure is there at least partially to inform us about God and his plan is the festival calendar. The word festival, though, is in awful and unfortunate translation. All right, so these things are also commonly referred to as feasts, which is just as bad. Okay, so in English, a festival is like a celebration. And usually in English, when we call something a festival, it's something that happens every year. Okay, so like the Indiana State Ice Cream Festival, whatever. Okay, like it's something that happens regularly. These things from the Old Testament that we're going through are not at all celebratory. Okay, some of them are actually pretty somber. So if we want to really understand what we're talking about, festival's not really a very good word to use. These are things that come around every year, but you should definitely not expect all of them to be presented as happy or celebratory times. The word the Old Testament uses here is also often translated as feast, as I just said. And in English, a feast means that we're going to have a bunch of food. Okay, so only one of these feasts even has a meal associated with it. All right, so one of them is entirely about fasting, and one of them is mostly characterized by what you cannot eat. Okay, so these are not really feasts either, by any definition of the English word. Feast is a insufficient translation of the intended meaning here. So just because somebody translates something as feast, and so that's the word we use for it, does not mean that you would even get fed during one of these feasts. All right? The actual Hebrew word here is moedim, and it translates most literally to appointed time. And so that's what we're talking about here. These are times appointed by God. And these are times that God described for the Hebrew people to have appointments with him. But we're also making an effort to demonstrate that these are appointments that we can have with God. So this is John D. Gar, PhD, THD. He's the founder and president of the Restoration Foundation. It's a Hebraic Christian community. And so this is his take on these appointments. It says the 7 festivals were designed by God to be appointments, the primary meaning of the Hebrew word moedim, which is generally translated as festivals or feasts in English. Since the word moedim can also be translated as rehearsals, it's also clear that the festivals were times for God's people to prepare for events that were still in the future. The 7 festivals are appointments that God has set on his calendar for meeting with his people. At the same time, they are rehearsals that point to the unfolding of messianic prophecy. All right, so that's a cool idea, and we're going with it. Okay, so these moedim are appointments with God, and they're also rehearsals for the future. All right, and it sure looks like these are all promised appointments that Jesus intends to keep with us. They're prophecies of the coming of God in his various forms into the presence of man. And so generally, these are best thought of as appointed times, not feasts or festivals. All right, so maybe you're a lot more familiar with the Jewish calendar than I am or was, but there seems like there's a lot of stuff and a lot of weird stuff on the Jewish calendar. Are we going to go through the whole Jewish calendar? You've probably heard of some of the Jewish calendar, all right? Maybe you know how to pronounce some of the names or what some of it means, or maybe how some of it is observed, but we're not going to do the whole thing. This is a very standard example of a list of the Jewish holidays that you'll find online. You're not supposed to be able to read it. You're just supposed to be able to see that there's a lot of things on there. But to say that something is Jewish is very different than saying that something is Christian. To be Jewish could mean that you're talking about a religion or an ethnicity or a nation, all right? So like maybe you're talking about all of those things. Maybe you're only talking about one of them. And so we are pretty specifically here this morning talking about the times that God set aside in the Old Testament. And that means that we're talking about what would exist today as the religion of Judaism. but we're kind of talking about an older version of that religion than what you would encounter today, because some of these things that we're going to be talking about have been dropped from the calendar, and some of them have been kind of all mixed together, and sometimes for good reasons and also for some pretty dumb reasons. But my point is that the religious days and the national holidays are all mixed together on a modern Jewish calendar. And some of the things on this list are things that we will talk about, and some of them are national holidays like our 4th of July or something like that, all right? So we're not going to talk about those. These 4 holidays here are on our list. We selected these 4 for one very important reason, all right? So the holidays that we won't talk about may very well be important times. They may even be God-honoring times. They may be things that happen in the Bible that people still do, okay? But they are not times that God himself put on this list. And that makes the difference for what we're talking about. So we're also going to talk about 3 additional times that used to be on this list, but for various reasons are not anymore. And so when it comes time to talk about it, we're going to switch out Rosh Hashanah for the Feast of Trumpets right here. And even this morning, we will squeeze the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Festival of First Fruits right here next to Passover. And so we'll also need to point out and adjust the fact that this list starts in the wrong spot. Okay, the Jewish Civil New Year starts with Tishri 1, and that's usually in September. And that's where this list starts. The Jewish religious New Year starts on Nisan 1. So that's in March or April. That would make the list start right about here. But this calendar starting in the wrong spot brings us to the place where we need to talk about the way that Hebrews reckon time and dates. Okay, so our calendar is the Gregorian calendar, been the standard calendar for most of the world since 1582. So that's when the world decided that they'd had enough of the Julian calendar that the Romans put together, which had each year being 11 minutes too long. All right, and so that may not seem like a large error, but if you're the Catholic Church and you're trying to calculate when Easter is based on when the equinox in March is, and the calendar's drifting 3 days every 400 years, then eventually you have to do something about it. All right, and so we have this huge reform to the calendar where they basically just eliminated 3 leap years from happening every 400 years. All right, whatever. This is an example of what a month on our calendar looks like. I hope that you're at least casually acquainted with this. This is a pretty good representation of the way that we think about time. Okay, it's a pretty linear flow. It moves from one day to the next, and then 1 month to the next, and so on. And I'm not saying that Jewish people can't or don't use calendars just like the ones that we do, but if you do a Google image search of Jewish calendars, most of them are round. The image that's up there is a standard 1-year Hebrew calendar. It's just an example of how their language and framework of time is just a little bit different than ours. And so where ours is sort of a linear flow like a river or a number line, theirs is more of a helix shape, sort of spins in cycles even as it heads in a direction. And so our Gregorian calendar is essentially a solar calendar, primarily based on how long it takes for the Earth to make 1 revolution of the sun, and that's 365.2425 days. And our calendar is actually pretty convoluted, but it seems normal to us because it's our calendar. And since 1752, the British government has insisted that each new year starts on January 1st. So most of us, that's our reference point, okay? We have just this one framework that we've ever viewed the question of, like, what is the date, okay? Each of our years has the same number of months, even if the number of days in a month is kind of a mess. Our days are each 24 hours long, and our hours are 60 minutes long. Each new day for us starts at midnight. So we wake up to a new day every morning. And so with all of its idiosyncrasies, there's still kind of a lot of regularity to our calendar. And we're used to it. It seems normal. The Jewish calendar is based on phases of the moon. And so the coming of the new moon has to be verified every month by 2 reliable witnesses who each saw the waxing crescent of the moon after the new moon. So that's called the head of the month, and it marks the arrival of the new month. Now, they say that the Jewish year has 12 months in it, but it takes 29 and a half days for the moon to complete a cycle. So if you multiply 29.5 times 12, you get 354 days, not 364.2425. So that's 11 days off every year. And that means that in just a couple of years, your fall, harvest festival that you have at the end of September is happening on July 4th. Okay? And it's moved to the middle of summer. And so to fix that problem, every 2 or 3 years, they insert an extra month at the end of the year. All right? So that extra month is after the month of Adar, so it's called Second Adar. So this compensation for the solar seasons technically makes the Jewish calendar a solar-lunar hybrid calendar, not a purely lunar calendar. So you'll see in the Bible that the hours of the day are called third hour, sixth hour, whatever. I'm sure that you know that they didn't have wristwatches, okay, or smartphones. So however much daylight they had every day, even if it was like 15 hours, it got divided into 12 pieces. And so they called them hours, all right? Not in English. That means that 1 hour was the first hour after sunrise. And, it might be 45 minutes long. It might be 75 minutes long. Each hour was counted this way. And so each day had slightly different lengths of hours, but all days had the same number of hours, right? Following? So then there's this issue that each day starts in a different place than ours. All right, you probably already understand this, but it gets kind of important as we're working out some of the points that we're going to make. Remember, I'm a graphic artist, so this little diagram is going to help clear things up. This is how our days and dates work. I hope this part is review for all of you. Okay? Our days start at midnight, and we start counting hours at that point until we get to 12, when we start over counting hours at noon. But it's still the same day. Okay? We wake up each morning to a new day. But because in the creation account, God marks each day with the statement, and there was evening and there was morning, and when God says that, he says evening first, so the Hebrew day starts with sunset. And so their day starts when 2 reliable witnesses each see 3 stars. All right, then it's a new day. And so the first meal of their day is the last meal that they eat before they go to bed. And they wake up each morning to the same day that they went to bed to. All right, so they start counting the hours of the day with sunrise. And so it's a little bit weird, but it's not terribly confusing until you start to apply our calendar and our way of thinking to their way of reckoning time and days. And so if God says that, for instance, the Feast of Tabernacles is supposed to begin on the 15th day of the month of Tishri, and we wanted to figure out when to do that, we would start by lining up the calendars. And so the 15th day of Tishri for last year or the year before, whatever, was September 20th. And so the Feast of Tabernacles begins on September 20th, right? No. The 15th day of Tishri and September 20th are only the same day for part of the day, because the 2 dates start at different times of the day. And so the 15th day of Tishri actually starts on September 19th. And the Feast of Tabernacles ended on September 27th of that same year. So when the sun went down on that day, and 2 reliable witnesses saw 3 stars each, the day was over, and so was the festival. So there's that detail and difference that you need to be aware of, because it does become a factor in some of the things that we're going to talk about. All right, so the last thing that we need to talk about is the way that each year starts. And so every year, December 31st, one of our years ends, okay? And another one begins on January 1st. And so we consider that date to be the start of our civil calendar and our social calendar and just about every other kind of calendar. The only real calendar that we even understand to have a different starting and ending time is sort of the idea of a fiscal year. So lots of businesses and corporate entities like designate a different date from December 31st for their end of the fiscal year for various like tax purposes and income reasons, whatever. We kind of get that, okay? Rosh Hashanah is the name that Jewish people generally refer to as the new year, and it happens like September-ish. Okay, it was like September 26th and 27th or something. I think that this year it's the 15th and the 16th. On the round calendar, it's the first day of the month of Tishri. And so this is pretty much their equivalent of our New Year's Day. It starts their civil year. It starts the year for figuring out the agricultural tithe. It falls directly on the equinox day that marks the end of summer and the beginning of autumn. And so it's called the New Year for seasons. But there are actually like 4 different New Years in Hebrew thinking. And so 2 of them have kind of dropped out of the mind of even most Jewish people, but not all of them. But there's one other New Year day that's still very prominent in Jewish culture and especially in Judaism. Okay, so this is our round calendar again. You can see that the month of Tishri that we talked about just a moment ago is at the bottom. Okay, just a little left of center and has a little 7 on it. So the month that starts the civil year is the 7th month of their religious year. And as I said near the beginning of this, incredibly engaging little rap, the religious year starts with the month of Nisan. And the first day of the month of Nisan is the first day of the year according to God. Okay, so for the Jewish people, that's their first day of their religious year. And so when God is talking to Moses and Aaron and describing what he wants the Jewish people to do in preparation for the Passover plague in Egypt, he says, there we go. It says, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. So God establishes the start of a timeline that repeats every year. And the message that he's sending only makes sense if you start in this place. And so the religion of Judaism totally understood this, and it does currently understand this. And so the round calendars pretty much all start with the first of Nisan. So because being Jewish has no real relation at this point in time to whether or not a person is observing Judaism, it's actually a little bit funny and a little bit sad that you can have this situation where there are still many of God's ordained and prescribed festivals on this list of Jewish holidays, but almost half of them have been absorbed or like reimagined as secular or national holidays. And the ones that are left aren't even in the right order for them to make the sense that God is trying to make sense out of them. And so you have to celebrate the new year right here for anything that God was trying to communicate to fall into place. So that's how we're going to lay these feasts out. We'll start where God tells us to start, and we'll let the pieces fall into place. And by dumb luck or divine providence, they're in the correct order on our calendar. All right? So that's kind of nice. We need to understand a couple of things about the way the word Sabbath is used. Okay, so what's a Sabbath? Seems like such a silly question. But there's actually a little bit to talk about here. You guys know we have names for days of the week, right? So Monday, Tuesday, today's Sunday, that kind of thing. You know what I'm talking about. Jewish people actually did not. They just numbered them. All right, so there's the first day, there's the second day, and they start over every week. Okay, so you're likely aware that God rested on the seventh day of creation, and then later when God is giving Moses 10 very special rules, he prescribed that the Jewish people would do the very same thing every seventh day. So this is commandment number 4 from Exodus 20. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. All right, whatever. So what God means by Sabbath is starting to take shape here a little bit. The seventh day doesn't have a new name, okay? It's still called the seventh day, but it's described as and set apart as a special day of observance to the Lord your God. All right, so Sabbath is not a day of the week like Saturday or Sunday. It's a day of religious observance and abstinence from work. And there is one every seventh day. And so the seventh day is what we would call Saturday. So every Saturday is a Sabbath. So that's the one that commemorates God's work of creation. It mimics his rhythm of working and then contemplating and fellowshipping. And God rests in satisfaction, not exhaustion. Okay, God doesn't rest because he's tired. And, you know, no doubt this is most likely put in place for our good. But God calls his people to observe other Sabbaths as well. Okay, these are days set aside for religious observance and abstinence from work that have nothing to do with which day of the week they fall on. And it should be slightly interesting to us that these other prescribed Sabbath days never make it so that the Jewish people do not also observe the seventh day Sabbath. Okay, these special Sabbath days are in addition to the weekly Sabbaths. And so these are often referred to as high Sabbaths. And they will almost always make it so that there's more than one Sabbath in a week. And so just so that I'm 100% sure that I've made my point, Sabbath is not a day of the week. Okay? It's a day of prescribed rest and religious observance. All right, so let's look at this text in Leviticus, see what God says about at least these first 3 festivals. Okay, so this is Leviticus chapter 23, starting at the beginning. It says, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. So the first thing I want to make clear, and it's one of the reasons that we're doing this, is that we tend to think of these rituals and these observances that the Jewish people have done for centuries as Jewish holidays or Jewish festivals or Old Testament observances. But these are God's festivals. Okay, or God's appointed times. They're appointments with God. And while it's completely true that it was the Jewish people that were commanded to observe these things and not us, that doesn't mean that we can overlook the details of what these appointments teach. And it may be that there could be some benefit to actually observing these appointments in order to sort of experientially learn the things that God was trying to give the Hebrews the opportunity to learn. So God, reiterates the weekly Sabbath. He puts it right here in this list with all the high Sabbaths and the other appointments. And, it is slightly set apart in the text. It does seem to be put first deliberately. Traditionally, rabbis, sages, people that were interpreting Scripture, they do determine that the Sabbath is the most important of these things, of all of these appointments. Maybe it is. But because it's set apart and it's already firmly established, it doesn't actually count as one of the festivals that this passage established and kind of sets in motion. Then God says that he's about to tell them what festivals are the ones that he's laying apart from the weekly Sabbath. It says, "These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times." All right, so you see the colon there, right? After where it says appointed times, the list of appointments comes next. All right, so that's what we're actually talking about. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. On the 15th day of that month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present a food offering to the Lord, and on the seventh day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So he jumps right into it with the first appointment of the year, right? We got Passover commemoration. It's already been described in detail by God, and so he doesn't do that here, but we're going to do that in a minute. But he does say when it's supposed to happen. It's the first month that God had established, not the one for the civil new year. So we're talking about the 14th day of the month of Nisan. But God says that this appointment starts at twilight. And you can't really tell in English, but this is not evening. Okay, evening is like when the day changes for them. All right, this is late afternoon that he's talking about here. This is actually between the evenings. So this is the only one of God's appointments that doesn't start with a new day. It starts when the 14th day is actually almost over. And then it actually goes until midnight of the same day for us. Okay, so it starts in the afternoon and it goes till evening. That's the same day for us. For them, the day switched right there in the middle of it. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute too. Then on the very next day, and for us, it would be just a couple of hours later in the same day, God names another appointment. All right. When the sun goes down on the 14th day of Nisan, it becomes the first day of the festival of unleavened bread. And so remember, their days begin at sundown. Passover is observed on the 14th of Nisan. So when the Passover meal is being eaten after dark, the festival of unleavened bread has begun. It's actually both Passover and the festival of unleavened bread for about 6 hours between sundown and midnight. So we got our second of the appointments with God put on the calendar, and this one begins and ends with one of those high Sabbaths that we're talking about. And so these are observed Sabbath days that do not necessarily fall on the weekly Sabbath. They are most likely in addition to the weekly Sabbath. And so this festival is first mentioned in Exodus. It's one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals that God lays out. And if we're reading it in Exodus, then it's already taken place when we come to this passage in Leviticus. But it's a little bit difficult to discern most of the time any practical difference in the minds of observers or authors between the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. And so that's why it's so common for people to refer to Passover as a pilgrimage holiday. All right, so it kinda is, and that's what people say, and that's what people write, and that's what people think, but it's actually the festival of unleavened bread that God names as the pilgrimage holiday. But because these two festivals, Passover and unleavened bread, kind of overlap and are at least adjacent to one another, they're often referred to as just one festival. So people refer to the 8 days of Passover. Passover is actually less than 1 day. And unleavened bread is 7 days. So the point is that like whenever you read or hear someone refer to either one of these festivals, you should just assume that they're referring to both, unless they give you some indication that they're making a distinction. So we got to read a few more verses to get the next one. Says the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you and reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. So God doesn't seem to give this next appointment a proper name, but he does tell them what to do. He says to bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. And then the priest would wave the sheaf before the Lord on the day after the Sabbath. And while this all seems very unclear to me about which Sabbath we're talking about and all that, it was not unclear to the Jewish people. And so they originally interpreted this to mean the day after the weekly Sabbath immediately following Passover. And so that makes this happen usually during the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it just so happens that this time works out really well for the first barley crop to be what they generally brought. And so God may not have named this festival, but when he told them what to bring, it kind of named itself. Okay, so this is the Festival of First Fruits. I hit the button too early again. Okay, so that's it. That's the establishment of the first 3 festivals of the year, and the ones that we're coming up on quite quickly this week, okay? And I think that the way that these play out in history and in prophecy is one of the most remarkable demonstrations of the sovereignty of God and the omniscience of God that I've come across in a long time. So let's see how quickly we can do that for these first 3 festivals. So the original Passover event is the background event that informs these first couple of festivals. And so the Hebrew people have been in Egypt for 430 years at this point. They were not slaves that whole time, but they've been slaves for a good while at this point. They don't really seem to remember not being slaves. But between God and Moses, they're planning to get the nation out of bondage, all right? And to that end, God has put the nation of Egypt, and to a large degree the Jews also, through 9 plagues. But the resolve of Pharaoh hasn't really relinquished, all right, even if it did seem to waver at times. And this Passover event is the 10th plague that God intends to be the big one that destroys the resolve of the Egyptians. And so we're going to look at Exodus 12 for just a minute. And so God is telling Moses and Aaron how to tell the Hebrew people how to prepare for this plague. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. All right, so God says that on the 10th day of Nisan, each man is to select a lamb for their family. And the word that is used for lamb here is, and he even says it, appropriate for use for a young sheep or a young goat. And the animal needs to be without defect. And we usually read this to mean that the lamb has to be perfect. All right, well, that's not really wrong. But the point is that it can't have something wrong with it. All right, you can't take your 3-legged gimp lamb with one ear and a mangy coat and sacrifice it to God. Okay, that's the lamb no one wants anyway. You have to give a good one to God. Take care of them until the 14th day. And so it says that they're supposed to take care of this goat until the 14th day of the month, which is a day that we've already talked about, all right? When all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and the top of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. So just just for the record, like most houses and places where people lived didn't really have barns or pens. So they kept these lambs probably in their houses. All right. And they were to all come together at twilight to slaughter their lambs. All right. So we'll pull that word apart in just a minute. Every house that's eating some of the lamb, they're supposed to put some of the lamb's blood on the sides and the top of the door frame. And that same night, they need to roast the sacrificed lamb over a fire in the house and eat every bit of it or burn whatever's left. And so for us, this same night would be the night with the same date. Okay, it would be the night of the 14th of Nisan. For them, this would be after evening and after sunset, so this would be the next date. Okay, so this would be the start of the 15th. All right? So let's make sure we've got a handle on what God said about when these things go down. So the Passover is on the 14th day of Nisan. First day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread occurs on the 15th day of Nisan. And the Feast of First Fruits is the first day after the weekly Sabbath after Passover. That one's fun to keep track of. All right, we're going to put together a timeline. This is Passover week. It has a couple too many days on it, all right? But we're going to use those later. This goes from the 10th of Nisan to the 17th. The days are intended to be divided like hours are, starting at midnight and ending at midnight. So that way it's easiest for us to understand, I think. And the 10th is the day that every family selects their lamb. And so technically it looks like the man selects the lamb for the family. And then on the 14th day of Nisan, everybody gets together and kills their lambs with edged implements or sharp sticks or whatever they have, probably just a knife. And the lamb that you select has to be a good one. It's unblemished and without defect. So for 4 days, there's this lamb probably living in your house that the family's caring for. And so later, this 4 days is taken to mean that you're making sure that the lamb doesn't have any defects that you didn't see at first. But there's something else that happens when a young lamb lives directly among your family for this period of time, right? On the 10th, when you select a lamb, it's a lamb. By the 14th, this is your lamb, right? You see what I mean? So by the time you have to kill the lamb, you're attached to it. And you kind of identify with it. And so you'll try not to get attached to it, but it'll still happen. And so in this 4 days of like observing and checking for defects, you become emotionally attached to your lamb. And then on twilight of the 14th day, we all sacrifice our lambs. And so you'll notice that generally the Bible uses the word evening when it means sundown. All right, this word twilight sounds to me like it happens like later than evening, but I honestly don't use the word twilight, and I don't really know if it has a specific meaning in English. What I do know is that when the word translated here is twilight, it actually literally means between the evenings, according to Young's literal translation. All right, and so their hours are different than ours. Remember that? All right, so once the sun has passed midday and was headed down, the first evening was when the time it took for the sun to go from noon to halfway to the horizon. All right, so like they're dividing up these hours like a protractor, right? Like when the sun is straight up, it's noon, or and then they're dividing it into pieces just by looking. And the second evening was the time it took for the sun to go from halfway down to sunset. And so it's like us saying afternoon and late afternoon. But if midday was generally around noon and the average length of the day is 12 hours, then it's 6 hours from noon to sunset. And so between the evenings is about 3 p.m. Okay? It's in that neighborhood of anyway. Then at 6 or 7 o'clock, the sun sets. And after that, the people eat their Passover meal. All right. So they're supposed to roast their lamb over an open fire with it completely intact with no broken bones. And the text says to do this on that night. But that night that has the same date for them would be the night before they kill the lamb. So they must mean the same night, the same way we would say it. All right? And that means that the date has changed for them. It's now the 15th of Nisan. All right, you still following? This is a lot. All right, this is also in this chapter of Exodus where God is giving instructions for the coming Passover plague. This is where we get the original instructions for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do not work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That's all you may do. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. All right, so there's our festival. There's its original premise for the why and what they're commemorating. And then he makes sure that they understand exactly when and a few other details. The point is that, like, don't eat any leaven. All right. No leaven at all, no matter what. Then the actual Passover happens, and during the actual Exodus, we have these verses here. It says, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. Clothing. All right, so they didn't have time to let their dough rise. They just grabbed it the way that it was. Going on a couple of verses, it says, that doesn't matter. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. All right, it's like God is giving them a way to make this festival make sense. He told them to eat unleavened bread for 7 days as a commemoration of this event before it happened, okay, before they had to make this bread from their hurried dough. And it already seems to me that the idea of not eating any leaven means more than just like the dough that they had to grab in a hurry, okay? Plus the consequences of excommunication are way out of whack with what's really going on, all right? So God really wanted them to make a big deal out of this leaven before they even had this thing here that it could be attached to. Then a little bit later in Exodus, this is chapter 23, God names the 3 festivals that he wants them to do in person. All right, so there's the festival of unleavened bread. There's the festival of harvest, which we call the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. And there's the festival of ingathering, which we call the Feast of Tabernacles, all right? And it says 3 times a year, all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. So it seems pretty clear to me that God's intention is for them to appear before him 3 times a year. That's what it says, okay? But wherever it is that God's supposed to be living, they're supposed to go there. All right, and so if God lives in a tent, then go to the tent. If God lives in the temple, go to the temple. But what do they do if there's no tabernacle and no temple? How does a Torah-observant Jew fulfill this obligation? Well, there's not much consensus on that question, and so some people say that it's not really a thing anymore. Some people say that you still need to go 3 times a year, all right? And people fall anywhere in between those things, though. People that still do pilgrimages for these feasts, they generally go to Jerusalem and they visit the Western Wall. All right, that's pretty much all that's left of Herod's temple. It's a retaining wall. It's big and it's cool, but it's not a place that God dwells. All right. So as all things do, the observance of Passover and these other festivals changes over time. All right. Right now, most people date Moses and, the Exodus to about 1,300 years before Jesus. It's a long time. And while some of the things about the observance of Passover are really easily recognizable, even today in reading the original instructions, there are some things that are different too. In the original Passover event, the lambs for each family were basically killed in a somewhat communal way, somewhere around where the people lived. But in time, all sacrifices to God had to take place at the tabernacle and then at the temple. And so the Passover lamb also had to be killed at the temple and then carried back home, wherever you were staying, to be eaten. And so man seems kind of drawn to the more legalistic side of religion. And so we like to add rules to things, and then we like to be able to judge our neighbor because we're more observant of the rules that we think are important than they are. And, the Passover is not exempt from that tendency. There were a few things that changed or were added by God over the generations. There were some historical circumstances that impacted the people's ability to observe the Passover the way that God had instructed. But many of the things that were changed seemed to be changes that people made because they thought it would be better or more meaningful because of the changes. And so by the time we get to the time of Christ, there are some things about these feasts that are already different. Okay, so the festival of unleavened bread, God named as a pilgrimage festival, and even by the time of Christ, because of the proximity of all three of these festivals, they were all kind of grouped together. Okay, they were just called Passover. So Passover is thought of as a pilgrimage holiday. And Jewish men and their families from all over the region would come to the city of Jerusalem, all right, for this week. And the population of that city would go from 30,000 people to around 175,000 people. It's a huge influx of people, but the city expected it. This happened every year. They made provision for it. But the Passover observance had changed a little bit from the time of Moses. And so for a couple of reasons, the people had really started to emphasize the Seder. And the Seder is the ritualized meal that originally had been put in place of eating the roasted lamb during the time of the destroyed temple in the Babylonian captivity. And so in the Seder dinner, there are symbolic foods added to the things that God told them to eat with the lamb. There's also a retelling of the Exodus story, all kinds of other cool things. But they were just a substitute for the sacrifice that they had no way to do at the time. But, the temple was rebuilt. And as soon as the people rebuilt Jerusalem, they started building a temple. And the new temple was usable right around 500 BC. It wasn't like the first one, but it was okay. And so the temple sacrifice was back. And even though temple sacrifice is back in full swing, the Jewish people had kind of become attached to their Seder meal. And the religious leaders started to make it even more formalized. And so they were even emphasizing the importance of the Seder meal above the importance of the parts of the Passover observance that God had put in place. And it was the group of religious leaders called the Pharisees that were pushing the most to emphasize the Seder around the time of Christ. And because of the repetitions of the instructions and the emphasis on the dramatic consequences, there was this huge emphasis on the preparations for the festival and the ridding the home of any leaven. And so they still understood this to commemorate the eating of the flat bread that the Israelites fleeing Egypt had to bake because there was no time for their bread to rise. But it was also a very clear picture that for these 7 days, leaven would get you excommunicated. And so for good reason, they're making a big deal out of getting leaven out of their homes. So everyone has to select a lamb on the 10th, right? But now it has to be a temple-approved lamb sold at the temple. So thousands of lambs are brought in from the east on the 10th to take them to the temple. This is the procession of the lambs. It was fun. It was cool. It was like a parade. It's like chaos and mayhem in the city of Israel, all right? And then they had this idea that you could have like a single national lamb You could still do your own lamb as long as you got it from the temple, but there would be one main lamb that the high priest would sacrifice for the nation. And it became kind of a big thing, all right? It was like a parade where they would bring this lamb down the prescribed route from Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, to the temple. The people would sing, they would wave, palm branches and have a party as this little lamb is paraded by. The lamb gets to the temple, the priest would observe it for 4 days to make sure it didn't have any hidden defects, and then on the 14th day of Nisan, the lamb was put on a leash that was staked near the altar so that everyone could see it, all right? And then between the evenings at about 3 p.m., the high priest would kill the lamb and throw the blood at the base of the altar, and he would say, Nishlam, all right, which is very much like saying completed. All right, we got some new things and some adjustments to our timeline. And so originally they spent the 4 days getting attached to the lamb with the idea that they were supposed to be checking it for defects. And now that is really what they think they are doing. Okay, the national lamb is being observed for 4 days. And so let's move this text balloon down here, make room for some stuff. And let's put here that we know the lamb was tied to the altar at the 3rd hour, or around 9 a.m. And so many people are still eating lamb for the Passover meal, but the emphasis has changed from the roasted lamb to the Seder, or the ritualized meal. All right, so keep tracking. We got a couple things to add still. In all the passages about the festival of unleavened bread, there's only 3 instructions that are ever really given by God. There are some special sacrifices to be offered at the temple for each day. It's also clear that the first and the last days of the festival are to be Sabbath days. These are high Sabbath days, different and in addition to the regular weekly Sabbath. And then there's the instructions for forbidding any leaven. And so these instructions for the leaven essentially boil down to no leaven anywhere, no matter what, okay? Or you get excommunicated. So what's leaven, right? Well, it's yeast, okay? I'm not going to read all this. It's fermentation. Yeast is a single-cell organism that digests sugar and starch and turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide, okay? The point, though, about leaven is that if you add a little bit to a big lump of dough, it doesn't take very long for the entire lump to get, fermented, okay? It spreads, it propagates through the new dough to start the fermentation process, even without any real aging going on, all right? And so bread with leaven in it looks like bread. Okay, it's squishy, it's soft. The flavor can be very complex. Bread without leaven, it's like a dense cracker or hardtack. Okay, it's like a big chunk of saltine. And during this 7-day festival, it's not enough to not eat the leaven, okay, or to not touch the leaven, or to hide the leaven so that you can't see it. Okay, Deuteronomy is really clear, okay? Let no yeast be found in your possession in all your land for 7 days. So someone's trying to make a point here, and that's cool, and it's clear that it's not a moral issue. This is a symbolic issue. If leaven were immoral, then leaven would be forbidden all the time. Okay, this is a teaching exercise that we're doing here. And in the 2nd chapter of Leviticus, it tells that only unleavened sacrifices can be burnt to God. Okay, so we're not reading that one either. So either God doesn't like the smell of burning yeast, or he's trying to give us a chance to understand something that wasn't very clear at the time that this was said. Okay, so they did painstaking preparations in getting rid of the leaven before this feast came about. Sometimes they would repaint their entire inside of their house to make sure that there was no leaven in it, all right? Their utensils are all boiled. Everything is, the pockets are turned inside out on their clothes, and everything is washed. And then they came up with this cool little ritual that developed over time. It's called the Bedikat Shamatz, all right? And it generally takes place on the night before the Passover dinner, So this translates as the search for leaven. And so the mother of the house would deliberately put like 10 crumbs of leavened bread around the house on the windowsills and stuff after the leaven has been, like thoroughly removed from everything. The father goes around the house like looking for leaven that they missed in the cleaning. And so then he sweeps it into a wooden spoon with an old goose feather. And then the whole search is done after dark by candlelight. All right, so the children follow the father around. It's very exciting, and they're telling him he's doing a good job, whatever. Once the father is done, he's sure that there's no more leaven in the house. The wooden spoon, the feather, and the crumbs are all put in a bag. The bag is tied with a string, and it's set outside to be burned in the morning. All right, so it's a cool little ritual. It has lots of variations. So this night right here starts the festival of unleavened bread. The 15th day of the month of Nisan is when God said this appointment starts. It's the first day of the 7-day appointed time of God that God said that the first and the last days of this feast are to be special rest days. Okay, that's high Sabbath days. And so remember, not the weekly Sabbath. Then on the 15th of Nisan, it's always a high Sabbath because it's always the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right, then the festival goes on for a full 7 days or 6 more days. We back up a little bit so that we can see a little bit more of the calendar. You can see that these two festivals just kind of merge together, and it's not at all unreasonable to think of them as just one thing. In a lot of ways, it really is the 8 days of Passover. But as I said earlier, they are intended to be by God to be distinct. Unleavened bread is not about the same thing that Passover is about, and it doesn't predict the same thing. So there's our Passover festival and the days on either side of it, and we can add that leading up to the appointment, they're feverishly cleaning and they're throwing things away, and right up to the point where they had this fun little ritual search for the last of the leaven. All right, that's pretty much where we are at this point. There are some simple and obvious correlations, right? Like there's a long tradition of the church attaching things about the Passover meal to the time of Christ and, saying that it's predictive and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure that it goes far enough in some places, and because of some messes in the timeline and things like that, I think maybe they make connections that aren't actually there in other places. They've come to stress the wrong things. Okay, there's one more obscure historical thing that I'm going to add. Okay, this is the Pseudomopsychete. There were different Jewish schools of thought, all right? We don't have time for this, really. But the people in Galilee lived under a different rabbi than the people in Jerusalem. And so they did some different things. Okay, so nobody cares. So Galilean, this is Beit Shammai that they were raised under. And one of the things that he added to what they had to do was this thing where they consecrated the firstborn males. Okay, so this is the opening verse of the chapter in Exodus where we were reading earlier. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me every firstborn male. The first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." So that's a pretty solid reason to find a way to consecrate every firstborn male. All right, and the way they did that was to spend a day doing no work. And the day that they landed on was the 24 hours prior to the Passover meal. And so by definition, that makes the 14th day of Nisan a high Sabbath day if you are a Galilean Jew functioning under the school of Shammai. Okay, and so the only exception to not doing any work was to sacrifice the lamb at the prescribed time. Then when the sun went down, they could roast the lamb and have their Seder just like they were supposed to. But because the entire 14th was a Sabbath for them, all of their prep for the Passover meal had to be done 24 hours before any Hebrew living under the school of Hillel in Jerusalem would have to have it done. Okay? And so when they got all of their preparations done 24 hours early on the 13th, they would have a big family meal together. And then all of the firstborn sons would fast until the Passover meal on the next night. Okay, the firstborns from Galilee would go 24 hours from Sudamoth-Siket to the Passover meal without eating or working, except to kill the lamb. All right, so let's put that on our timeline because our heroes are from Galilee, and that might matter. 14th of Nisan is a Sabbath day under the school of Shammai. So for any observant Galilean Jews, the 14th is a high Sabbath. The 15th is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, so it's a high Sabbath if you're any kind of Jew. Okay, and because our heroes are Galileans, we'll point out where this big dinner of Sudamoth-Siket falls. Okay, so that's pretty much it for setting this up. This is how it happened in the time of Jesus. All right, we'll start by placing the weekly Sabbaths where there is the most consensus that they were on the Passover week that Christ was crucified. All right, so that's easy enough. This is a passage in John chapter 12. Try and find a place to start our clock running. It says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him. All right, 6 days before the Passover, right? That's what it says. Passover's the 15th, so as long as there's no witchcraft or translation errors, then that puts us on our regular weekly Sabbath that Jesus came into Bethany. And then it was the next day. There we go. It was the next day that he heads into Jerusalem, which puts him on the 10th of Nisan, that Jesus makes his triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem. And he's riding on a donkey to indicate that he comes in peace. He followed the exact same path as the procession of the Lamb. And so I have no idea if he came before the Lamb or after the national Lamb that day, but those people were already out there to welcome the symbolic Lamb. They just unexpectedly bumped into the real one. All right. And then for 4 days, that national Lamb is being observed and checked for defects. What's going on in the life of Jesus? All right, so we could do this all day, but here is a small example from Matthew's account of events of one of the many interactions that Jesus had that week with the religious authorities. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they didn't find any, though many false witnesses came forward. All right, so Jesus is arrested. Luke tells us that Pilate can find no basis for a charge against this man. So Pilate sends Jesus back to Herod, but Jesus won't do magic tricks for him, so Herod sends him back to Pilate, and it says, I've examined him in your presence, and there's no basis for your charges against him. Okay? So, while the lamb is being observed and checked for defects, as hard as they tried, they couldn't find a single thing wrong with Jesus. All right, by any and all standards, he was found to be without defect and unblemished. All right, so there's another thing that I want to throw out there about this Galilean practice of Sudamoth-Siket. Because the firstborn sons wouldn't eat again until Passover, and because if God had not spared them in Egypt, it would have been one of their last evening meals as a family, the literal translation of Sudamoth-Siket is the Last Supper. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Let's put the Last Supper right here. That would put the Garden of Gethsemane here and the arrest of Jesus here. In Mark 15, it says it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. That means that we can put right here that Jesus was hung on the cross after being interrogated and beaten all night at about 9 a.m. Mark says 9 a.m. for the crucifixion, but John says noon. There's a lot of what seem like little discrepancies in the text here in regard to timing. I have found satisfactory resolutions to most of them, but not all of them. All right, frankly, I didn't even try on this one. But the time that we're done here this morning, you'll probably have some questions, okay? Like I have questions still, but this is worth looking at, all right? Anyway, Jesus is on the cross at 9 a.m. I'm going to throw out a couple of remarkable things about these hours on the cross, okay? So there's the blood on the doorposts, right? Take that for what it's worth, but some people think that it kind of looks like a cross, all right? John does tell us this little interesting bit. The soldiers are dividing his clothes into 4 shares, and actually he had a nice coat, all right? They don't want to tear it, and so they said, let's decide by lot who will get it. And that's cool. Mark 15 says that at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. All right, so they've mistaken him saying Eloi for him saying Elijah, and for whatever reason, they can't understand him. But what's he saying? So this is a passage that people often say proves that Jesus didn't understand that he was supposed to die. Okay, that he's some tragic martyr figure that was suppressed by the religious elite or whatever. And then more devout people say that this means that God had to turn his back on Jesus when sin came into him, and Jesus was just overcome with desolation at this moment. All right, but I'm pretty sure that Jesus is reciting song lyrics. All right, yeah, I said that. Jesus has a number of his followers around him on the cross. Jesus and his followers are devout, Torah-observant Jews. They know all the Psalms, and they know a bunch of the Old Testament by heart in song. Okay, and Psalm 22 is a pretty universally agreed messianic psalm, and it starts by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? All right, so you understand what Jesus just did, right? If somebody says, somebody once told me the world is going to roll me, I ain't the sharpest tool in the shed, right? What happens? You start playing through the song, okay? So that's what happens when anybody starts to say a song. And this is the rest of this same psalm, okay? It says, dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me, they pierce my hands and my feet, all my bones are on display, people stare and gloat over me, they divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. All right, so that's kind of eerie. This is not a fortune cookie, all right? This is not Nostradamus. This is strangely specific about a pretty weird and obscure thing. And this is just me talking, but it seems to me like this is the moment on the cross when Satan realizes that he has miscalculated terribly. All right, Satan knows that the scriptures say things that are going to happen. He knows them better than any people do. And when Jesus says this song starts to play in Satan's head just like it does everybody else's. And he looks around when he gets to this part of the song and he realizes that Jesus intended to be in this place, hanging on this cross from the very beginning. All right? The devil didn't put Jesus on the cross. Okay? He didn't eliminate the Messiah before he could do his work. Satan helped orchestrate the events that led directly to his defeat. Okay? And then the psalm ends. Okay. Mark tells us that someone ran. No, we're skipping that. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. I wonder what he cried out. Okay, well, John, who was definitely there, tells us what Jesus said. It said, when he had received the drink, Jesus said, it's finished. With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. That's interesting. This could very well be the same as the high priest saying Nishlam as he sacrifices the national lamb. All right, this could be the last line of the Psalm 22 where he says he has done it. Either of those are pretty cool. Could be both. But John writes this as the single Greek word tetelestai, and that has some additional connections, okay? I'm not going to read all of this. But the fact is that telestai was commonly used to stamp over a certificate of debt that a criminal had or a debtor had when they had completed their sentence or paid their debt. All right? It means that it's finished, and it means that it's paid in full. Okay? And so you have this situation here where if you had your certificate of debt that listed your crimes and it had tetelestai on it, then you weren't liable for those things anymore. And Jesus has a certificate of debt nailed over his head. It's funny, it says he's the king of all the Jews. Okay? So there's no crimes because he's actually the king of the Jews. And what he says is that our certificates of debt are paid in full when he says tetelestai. All right, so this is like the central moment in the history of the universe, right? Like everything pivots on this moment. And let's just go ahead and point out that Mark tells us that this all goes down at about 3 p.m. All right, so he's put on the cross in the morning. We can add to our little timeline that he gives up his spirit and dies on the cross between the evenings, or at about 3 p.m. So this is the completed timeline again for the Passover week and the nation of Israel, and here's our completed timeline for the Passion Week of the Christ. All right, there's just about nothing that happens in that week that doesn't have an indication that God knew it was going to happen, all right, and planned for it to happen. And by the time, we get through all of these festivals, I hope that you feel that way about all of them, all right? All 7 of them, not just the 3 we're doing today. So the Passover is not just some vague foreshadowing of events that kind of redeemed mankind. It's a carefully planned and executed mission that was fully formed in every detail, a minimum of 1,300 years before it actually happened. Okay, this is the most remarkable predictive record that I've ever seen. Okay, it's so specific. This is like the final apologetic for the remarkable accuracy and the truth of the scriptures. Okay, and of course it's true that I deliberately lined up the timelines. Okay, but I didn't make any of this stuff up. Okay, I didn't stretch anything that was said. All I did was throw out the traditional ideas that go with what the Bible says. Okay, so you're going to love this part. This is where I get stoned. I'm sure that many of you already can see this, but let's go ahead and make it explicit. If we lay the days of the week by our names over our timeline of the Passion Week, then it starts to look like maybe something's wrong, right? The triumphal entry happens right where it's supposed to on what we generally call Palm Sunday. I'm not going to mess with Easter. It's right where it belongs. But if you look at Good Friday, there's something absent from the things that are supposed to happen. All right, so allow me to introduce you to Good Thursday. This is not a new discussion, though. People have actually been arguing about the day of the death of Jesus since very shortly after he died. It's called the Paschal controversy. There are lots of reasons to believe either way, okay? Nobody cares why I believe this one. But the crux of the argument that Jesus died on Friday rests on the fact that the day after his death is clearly a Sabbath. Okay? All of the accounts make it super clear. But most of the arguers are either unaware or they just ignore that the 15th of Nisan is a high Sabbath no matter what day it falls on. Okay, and so when Matthew says that Jesus was raised on the day after the Sabbath, at the beginning of Matthew 28, he uses the Greek word Shabbaton, not the word Shabbat. And so the word he uses is the word for 2 Sabbaths in a row. And I don't care what you decide to believe, okay? I absolutely encourage you to look at it yourself. But don't stop looking when you find the answer you're looking for, okay? Gather more information and keep looking. All right, so leaven is often used as a metaphorical picture. Bad influence most of the time, not all the time, is what they're talking about. So Jesus says, be careful, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees. He's talking about how it permeates what they're talking about. The disciples are idiots, and they think that he's saying that they forgot to bring the bread. But, then Paul says, okay, very similarly. So the Judaizers are coming out behind Paul and changing everything that he says. And so Paul says, you were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? That kind of persuasion does not come from the one who calls you. A little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. And then he's writing to the super screwed up Corinthians, and they have this guy that's involved in this like blatant, sexual immorality, and even the pagans wouldn't accept it. But he encourages them to get rid of this guy. And when he says that, he's like, get rid of you need a new unleavened batch without this sin that's permeating everything. All right. So that's cool. Before we move on, I wanted to point out that it says, get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are. As you really are is the unleavened part. And he's calling them to their new identity in Christ, where they're positionally without sin, as seen by God through the blood of Christ. All right? And so Jesus is cleansing the temple, right, in the week before he goes. And so while the people in the town are running around washing their houses and throwing out any leaven, the exact same time coming up on Passover, Jesus is driving the money changers. He's doing the same thing. You see that? Okay, and so we're not reading the quotes. And, okay, I bet that they knew, he knew that this was going to have this effect, all right, where the driving the money changers out is the trigger for them killing him, all right? So it is, actually. So that's what they said. They had all they could take. Jesus is threatening their income. All right, so we're going to blur the lines the way that we need to. John the Baptist himself says that Jesus is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. The last week of Jesus' life, there was the Last Supper, and it's traditionally viewed as Jesus and his disciples having their Passover meal together, all right, where they would have been eating lamb and unleavened bread. But if the Last Supper took place on the night before the Passover meal, then it was a Seudah Mafseket meal that they shared together. And in that case, in all likelihood, it was leavened bread that they shared at that meal. And so this notion is actually reinforced by the accounts in the Gospel of Luke and John, all right, where the word that's used for bread at the Last Supper is the specific Greek word that's translated as bread. All right, not unleavened bread. All right, and not reading it. But it is kind of interesting, okay, because it's leavened bread that he takes into his body that's given for us. And so maybe this messes with your theology of communion a little bit, but it's actually more fitting than the alternative, I think, if you look at the whole thing. In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says that Jesus was made to be sin on our behalf. All right, and 1 Peter says that he bore his sins on our body on the cross. So it's Christ who's been cleansing his house all during the week, who on the night before Passover takes the last bits of sin into himself and carries them to the cross, leaving us to eat unleavened bread for the next 7 days, symbolizing not some stupid flight from Egypt or the sinless body of Christ, but the sinless state that we are now in, as viewed through the blood of Christ. So we are the ones who are forgiven and pure. All right, so there's your Passover week. There's the Last Supper. No, not doing it. First fruits. All right, first fruits is the last thing. The festival of first fruits is essentially a faith offering to God of the first grain from the harvest that thank him for the bountiful harvest that you'll get in the future, okay, when the final harvest is done. So the principle at play here is that you can thank God for something that hasn't happened yet because he says it will happen. And so the offering is both the proof that you believe it will happen and the evidence from God that it will happen. Okay, and the New Testament clearly uses this imagery from the festival when it refers to Christ. It says, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. Here's our timeline, how the festival week is laid out one last time. The Passover lamb is sacrificed at mid-afternoon on the 14th day of Nisan. When the sun goes down, it becomes the 15th day. It becomes the high Sabbath. It's the first day of unleavened bread. It's also time to eat your Passover meal and observe the Seder. The following day is the weekly Sabbath. And the Sunday that follows the weekly Sabbath, which is always on a Saturday, is the festival of first fruits. And here's your Passion Week. Okay, on top of all of the other correlations that we've talked about in the last 2 hours, okay, Easter Sunday, the day that the tomb is found to be empty, happens on exactly the same day that God told the people to observe the festival of first fruits. Paul didn't miss this connection, okay? He mentions it almost casually and as a matter of course more than a few times, all right? So Jesus' resurrection is the proof that we will be resurrected later. It is both the proof that it's going to happen and the evidence that God has the power to make it happen. And so, like, this is the biggest, coolest thing that has ever happened. Okay, this is absolutely extraordinary in the level of detail that God put into predicting this and executing it. There's no way that you can say that a single human author or even multiple human authors went back through time and like lined up all of these things. Okay, you can't make a decent case that this is coincidental. All right, it would take unimaginable faith to believe that this is not a planned and deliberate foretold event. All right, and if the reality of this even comes close to what we've talked about today, then you really are faced with deciding how you're going to react and what kind of effect that this has on your view of God and your view of your own life. So these appointed times of God are not meaningless rituals. They're not like vague foreshadowing. They are specific, prescribed rehearsals for future events. They are like precise timelines and dramatic apologetics for an overarching plan of God. All right, and I understand that they give away almost nothing about what to expect in the future, but looking back at their fulfillment is absolutely incredible in how many details are included. All right, so we'll get into some more details about first fruits next week, and we'll make a case for why you can consider yourself a thinking person and still actually believe that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. So that's our standard Easter Sunday message. But we're making efforts as a community to integrate the observance of these festivals into our annual calendar. That's what Clay was talking about earlier. Seems like it might be important if we can, see what they actually are and we can experience what God intended for them to teach. And so there's, like Clay said, there's going to be a Seder dinner at most of the home groups this week, possibly in individual family homes, and we're going to be putting together something that will acknowledge first fruits next week on Easter. So it's part of the plan to actually start to do this. I know it's weird, but that's the plan.